Okay, so we're going to go ahead again. Hopefully you saw the email I sent this morning. And, well, first, before I even do that, thank you. There's about, so we got about 60 or 70 people on the line. We've got a bunch of managers. Thank you very much. We also have some OAs, which I appreciate. Thank you. And even some receptionists. So thank you very much. The email I sent out this morning actually discussed two different things. Number one, the buyer contingency addendum, which we're going to get to here shortly, but I also just wanted to give you an update on the seller financing addenda that AAR had put out in December. And actually, my last webinar was actually on those different addenda, and they're all regarding essentially seller carrybacks. Scott Drucker, the general counsel of AAR, last Friday, I believe, actually had a phone conversation with a gentleman from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, better known as CFPB. And one of the questions that we had was regarding rental properties. When a buyer is buying a property and the seller is doing a carryback and the property is going to be as an investment, where does that fall into the specific addenda? And when we put these, and I think I mentioned before that I actually chaired this committee. We started last summer to work on the different addenda, and as you can see, there's quite a few different scenarios, and 4 different forms were produced, and we are kind of sort of being led blindly by the Dodd-Frank Act itself, which is over 1,000 pages, and even the summary is 600 pages. We did have one member of the work group, Amy Swaney, who is a mortgage originator, and she was an immense help. And again, her name is Amy Swaney. So if you ever have a chance, if she is speaking at any classes that are coming up regarding Dodd-Frank, she is excellent, and I would highly recommend you take those classes from her. She's very, very knowledgeable, and she was pretty much our backbone from the Dodd-Frank side of it on the rules themselves and what we needed to incorporate into these forms. But it still left a lot of questions unanswered, and obviously AAR wanted to get out forms as soon as possible because the law was changing. The federal law was changing in January, so we wanted to make sure that if there were any seller carrybacks that were effective in January, that they did follow the new rules and the use of the new addenda. What Scott found out when he had this conversation was regarding, again, when a buyer is buying the property under a seller carryback and is using it as an investment property, has no intentions of living in it, essentially it's going to be a rental or a flip or whatever the case may be. And the response that he received back from the CFPB was essentially if a residential dwelling is being purchased as a rental or a non-owner occupied property, it is not governed under the new Dodd-Frank restrictions. So essentially the new restrictions only govern consumer credit transactions, which is when it's just a consumer buying and it's a consumer essentially selling, but basically a consumer buying. But once a buyer is an investor, then he is not considered a consumer, quote unquote, by definition, and this is now what they consider a business transaction. So since it's a business transaction and not a consumer credit transaction, they are exempt from the Dodd-Frank. So that's the good news. The bad news is consequently AAR has to revise the 3 forms that are out there regarding seller financing, and essentially they're going to be changing the title of the forms. And the title, just so you know, and this will be done, they should be live February 3rd on the AAR Zip form site. The first one will be the seller financing addendum, consumer credit transactions secured by an owner-occupied dwelling, and that's the one where the seller's a natural person, an estate, or a trust. Then you've got the second one, which will now be titled Seller Financing Addendum Consumer Credit Transaction Secured by an Owner-Occupied Dwelling. Pretty much the same title, but underneath that is going to say this is the 1 to 3 properties in any 12-month period, where the first one is only 1 property in any 12-month period. And then you have the third one, which was the current form was exempt anyway from the Dodd-Frank Act, and at the time we thought that was just for commercial or vacant land because, again, it's not secured by a, quote, dwelling, and a dwelling is defined as a residential structure that contains 1 to 4 units. So now the title to that one will be Seller Financing Addendum Credit Transaction Not Secured by an Owner-Occupied Dwelling. So now as a buyer who's an investor who's buying the property is non-owner occupied, the third form is the one that they will use because, again, if they're not securing it on an owner-occupied dwelling, it's going to be secured on a non-owner occupied dwelling. So it falls into the same category then as a commercial or vacant land. So I just wanted to give you a heads up on that change. Again, look for the forms on Zip Forms February 3rd, and the cover sheet on those forms as well. The attention seller will also have some language that refers to this. But again, the biggest change is, to summarize, if the buyer is an investor, non-owner occupied, then they are exempt from the Dodd-Frank Act, and they would use addendum number 3. So hopefully that is clear as mud. If you have any questions, feel free to either give me a call or send me an email later, and I'd be happy to try to clarify it any way I possibly can. What we're going to talk about today is the brand new Buyer Contingency Addendum. You can see on your screen that actually this is a draft because, again, as I mentioned in my email this morning, this is not even out yet. It will not come out until February 3rd or on or about February 3rd through AAR's Zip Forms site. But since I also chaired this work group, that gives me the benefit of getting these draft forms prior to the time that they actually go live. So this is the first time you'll have seen this, and I wanted to first give you some history. A few months ago, I did a webinar on the old Buyer Contingency Addendum, and we kind of went through it and how it works. And I did mention at that time the old or still current Buyer Contingency Addendum has a major flaw in it, and essentially this was actually brought to my attention by our Chandler branch manager, Leah Lichter-Rodig. Actually, it was 2 years ago last December, and this is how sometimes the wheels at AAR take a while because you have to all the forms have to go through so many different committees, even to get approval to revise a form. And then once the form has an approval to revise it, then a work group is set up, and then you've got bazillion meetings with the work group. Actually, we started this work group back in April of 2013. So when we didn't finish it until pretty close to the end of the summer, I believe it was in August of 2013, and we couldn't get it approved through the different AAR committees fast enough in order for it to go live on AAR Zip Forms as a revised form on September 1st because the committees were not meeting. So they had to wait until the different committees met during the fall, finally got actually full approval for this to go live just last week from the AAR's executive committee. So that's a little background on why these forms, all forms, take a little while to get out. That being said, as you all know, and I mentioned this before, that AAR only puts out either new or revised forms twice a year, and it's either February 1st or thereabouts, or August 1st or thereabouts. They have decided to make this 3 times a year, and so you will be seeing either new or revised forms coming out in either August, February, or June. And to give you an example why this was changed, there's actually going to be, there's a revised seller property disclosure coming out, the SPDS. And the changes are pretty, there's some that are pretty major, most are not. The main big change is it's now going to have information on solar panels and whether they're leased and whether they're not. The seller is supposed to attach a copy of the lease because the fact that there are solar panels on a property and if they're leased, the buyer must, and I say must, assume that lease. And in some cases, after the contract's been fully accepted, the buyer finds out they can't qualify for that lease, and therefore it's a deal breaker. So there's going to be information in the SPDS about that and a few other things. But we didn't want to have to wait until August for this major change, and we couldn't get it through the committees in time for February. So that's one of the reasons why the rules at AAR, the policies have been changed to now you're going to see 3 times a year new or revised forms will come out as needed. And if at any time there's a law change, Dodd-Frank is a perfect example of that, and these seller financing addenda, they came out in December because there was a federal law change. So there will be exceptions to those 3 times a year if there are federal or state law changes where a tweak to the purchase contract needs to be made or one of the addenda, or in any case, then they'll make exceptions to that 3 times a year rule or 2 times a year rule. So anyway, so here we are in the buyer contingency addendum. So again, Leah came to me with this law because here's the situation that we had. We represented the seller, and the buyer writes an offer that is contingent upon the buyer's house, current house, selling. The buyer's agent attached the buyer contingency addendum, which was obviously the right thing to do, and at the time of this contract, the buyer's house was already under contract. And so the seller has the option, they still do, to receive a copy of that contract to make sure everything looks good, and before they actually get 5 days after the acceptance of this contract to decide if they want to go forward with this based on what that other contract looks like. Where are they in it? Are they through the inspection period? Does the buyer look like their financing is going well, et cetera, et cetera. So in this particular case, everything looked good. Seller went ahead and accepted the contract, and life went on. The buyer performed their inspections on this house. Everything was fine. There were about 3 weeks prior to the close of escrow when the buyer's agent notifies our listing agent that the buyer's contract canceled on their house. And so looking over the verbiage of the addendum, the seller was like, okay, what is my recourse at this point? And we came to determine that the seller had no recourse. The only thing the buyer could do is try to get another buyer under contract and to be able to close within the time frame mentioned in this addendum, which was either right before the close of escrow of this contract or simultaneously the close of escrow of this contract. So there's a buyer obviously drop dead date. In this particular case, the buyer could not find a buyer for their property that quickly. The seller could do nothing but sit there with a fully executed contract, can't go active in MLS, and twiddle their thumbs until the close of escrow on this contract came and went, and the buyer obviously could not perform because they could not get another buyer on their property, and the buyer at that time was able to cancel, get a full refund of their earnest money because it was an unfulfilled contingency built into this addendum. So essentially, if the buyer couldn't close by the date they said they could close, then by verbiage of the current addendum, soon to be known as the old addendum, it said that the buyer, then the contract is deemed canceled, the buyer receives the earnest money, and it is deemed an unfulfilled contingency. So you can see where the disadvantage was to a seller. So at that time, I actually went to AAR and I said, hey, we got a problem with this form. They agreed, and we just started the process, the quite lengthy process to come up with this new contingency addendum. And this was a really difficult addendum to put together because every single solitary word had to be vetted to make sure that when, in my theory and the same philosophy with at AAR is we'd rather give you a form that you can use to fit a specific situation than you as the agent writing legal language into the additional terms and conditions section of the purchase contract. Because we know, and believe me, I've lived it through many, many, many forms, that if one word is incorrect or could be perceived as not exactly in other words, the intent of the verbiage when written could mean one thing, and 2 years down the road, when you read that same verbiage, it means something totally different, and that's what we want to obviously avoid. You guys are not attorneys. I'm not an attorney. On these work groups, we have attorneys. Obviously, Scott Drucker is an attorney, and he's always in these work groups. And to go back to the seller financing addendum, we actually had 3 attorneys. We had Rick Mack from Mack, Watson, and Stratman. And we also had John Latardo, who is the general counsel for Stewart Title, because it was important to get the title side on those seller financing addenda as well. So that's why you really struggle through every sentence on some of these different addendum, and this one is a good example of that. So anyway, we're going to start out. Okay, so you have the following conditions. Additional terms and conditions are hereby included as part of the contract between seller and buyer for the above referenced premises, and you have, again, the 2 choices. If marked by an X and initialed by the seller and buyer, the terms and conditions of the contract are included herein by reference. So you've got the first box, as you can see, and this is the contingent on an accepted offer for buyer's property. Most of this first part is very similar, if not identical, to the current buyer contingency addendum. This contract is contingent on buyer accepting an offer, so this is where they haven't received an offer yet on their house. And has the buyer accepting an offer to purchase, which is considered the accepted offer, buyer's real property located at the address, buyer's, which is referred to as buyer's property, and delivery of the accepted offer documents described on lines 50 to 54, which we'll get to, and basically it's a laundry list of what documents, purchase contract, any addenda, et cetera, to seller for review within 3 days of execution of the accepted offer or by blank. Okay, so that's the drop-dead date. The first on line 11, the date that would go there is when does the buyer need to get under contract on their on their property. When's that date? Okay, so we're talking about just what is the requirement per that date and when the buyer's home must go under contract. So let's say it's today. You're writing up this offer, and you say that the seller must seller must receive a copy of the accepted offer on the buyer's property no later than February 15th, okay, let's say. And so again, and so whichever comes first, meaning if the buyer receives an offer prior to that February 15th date. Seller may, within 5 days of receipt of the accepted offer documents, cancel this contract and all earnest money shall be returned to buyer. So again, if the seller gets a copy of that contract and maybe that contract is contingent upon that buyer's property selling, or maybe there's some really funky terms in it, or maybe who knows what, but the seller says, you know what, I don't accept this contract, and they may cancel this contract based on that contract that the buyer submitted on their house. So hopefully I haven't lost you yet. Unless seller cancels this contract within 5 days of receipt of the accepted offer documents, this contract shall become contingent upon the closing of the pending sale of buyer's property by, so let's say they have to have an offer in by February 15th, so we'll give them, let's say, March 15th, all right, or maybe March 14th. And the close of escrow of this contract may be March 16th or maybe March 14th. Again, it depends on the terms. If this is going to be a cash deal, but the buyer needs the money to close on his house in order to pay cash for this one, then you might want to have obviously a few days prior to the closing of this one. But there you have a drop-dead date on line 14, which is going to be the close of escrow of the buyer's property, okay, which you want to have at least concurrent with, or I would suggest a few days prior to the close of escrow of this one. Okay, cancellation of accepted offer for buyer's property. Okay, so here it is. If buyer's accepted offer cancels for any reason, buyer shall deliver notice to seller within 3 days of buyer's receipt of cancellation and provide evidence of cancellation. Because again, this is another thing, we were thinking it out during this work group and said, okay, well, what if a buyer just finds another house and they like better? And they say, okay, I want to cancel this because they make up a story that I want to cancel this because my buyer canceled. Okay, prove it. Okay, so they have to send evidence of the cancellation. Notice to seller shall state buyer's election to either. So now the buyer has to make a decision. Okay, their contract's canceled on their house. Immediately cancel this contract, and all earnest money shall be released to buyer, or, and this is the big or, proceed with this contract by removing this buyer contingency. Okay, so they're removing this contingency on the sale of their house, and provide, number one, excuse me, written documentation from buyer's lender. The buyer can close escrow by the close of escrow date without the sale and closing of buyer's property. Okay, so if the buyer's property, the sale of the buyer's property was contingent upon them getting that money to be able to either buy this house or to get the loan, now they can't qualify for two properties. So they need something from the lender saying, yeah, I can qualify for both properties. I don't have to close on that one. So we need documentation. So all of a sudden, because without that documentation, gee, sorry, can't close on this one, unfulfilled loan contingency, and the buyer gets earnest money back. So we say, okay, you have to prove to us that you can still close on this one. Or if this is an all-cash sale, okay, again, need the money, though, from that other house, or they must provide evidence of buyer's financial ability to close escrow by the close of escrow date without the sale and closing of buyer's property. So do they have enough money to be able to not worry about that house canceling, that they can still come up with the cash? They're not depending on the cash from that sale of that house in order to close on this one. Okay. Should buyer elect to proceed with this contract, seller and buyer agree that all other contingencies remain. So you still have the financing contingency, and you still might have the appraisal contingency, but essentially the buyer has made it a decision once that contract canceled on their other house. So they either cancel this one or they want to go forward with this one, but they're waiving the contingency, the buyer contingency. So this is the big change on this form as opposed to how it currently is. Buyer's contingency. If buyer fails to deliver accepted offer documents to seller by the date specified on line 11, and again, we'll go back there, and that's the one where, okay, you need to have an accepted offer by that particular date. The contract shall be deemed canceled and all earnest money shall be released to buyer. So if they can't get a buyer by that date, and I think my example was February 15th, then they can say, okay, fine, we'll cancel at this point. So the object is not to keep the seller hanging out there, that the seller knows up front, okay, this is the date that buyer needs to get an accepted offer to me. If they don't, then the deal's off. And if they do and something happens, then essentially not that the seller has recourse if that deal cancels, but the buyer has to fish or cut bait, as I say. Either they want to fish, they want to go forward, and they can prove they can go forward financially, or they can cut bait and cancel the deal right now. If seller accepts a subsequent offer, a backup contract, to purchase the premises before the buyer has delivered to seller the accepted offer documents, seller may deliver written notice to buyer. Okay. Upon receipt of seller's notice, buyer shall have 5 days to deliver to seller a written notice to remove the buyer contingency. So if here comes a backup contract, the seller can then deliver to buyer notice of the backup contract prior to the time the buyer's property has gone under contract, okay? Again, the buyer has two choices. The buyer can either cancel it right now or go forward. In other words, the seller said, hey, I got another buyer. What are you going to do here, buyer? Okay, they have two choices, either cancel or go forward and be able to prove that they can go forward. So the buyer shall have 5 days to deliver to seller a written notice to remove the buyer contingency, and such notice from buyer shall include, again, the written documentation from buyer's lender that the buyer can close escrow by the close of escrow date without the sale and closing of their property, or if it's a cash sale, that they provide evidence that the buyer has the financial ability to close escrow by the close of the escrow date without the sale and closing of the buyer's property. If buyer fails to waive this contingency, this contract shall be deemed cancel and earnest money shall be released to buyers. So if they elect to cancel, then the deal's off, they get their earnest money back. So again, if buyer fails to waive this contingency, and they just say, I'm canceling, I'm not going to waive it, I'm canceling it, then they get their money back. And then obviously the buyer and seller's initials are required. So that's the first box. Again, that's the first section. Here's your box. Again, this is the one where the buyer's property has not gone under contract yet. And here's the second box. Again, the first few lines are the same as the existing, essentially. Buyer has an accepted offer, and this contract is contingent upon the close of escrow, the closing on buyer's real property located at address. Buyer's property, okay, so this is the close of escrow date of that property. Property is under contract now. The buyer has an accepted offer. Box 1, no offer yet. Box 2, they're already under contract. This is similar to, or was, in my example of what happened out of Leah's office, this was the box that was marked. Accepted offer documents described on line 50 to 54, and we'll go there real quick. The following terms apply to either, within the time specified in the applicable section, buyer shall deliver the accepted offer documents to seller, including a copy of all purchase contract documents evidencing the sale and whatever it is. The BINSR, how did that play out? Because obviously if the buyer's property is already under contract, it's a big deal to the seller to know that the BINSR's already been negotiated, if that's the case. If there's any other type of addenda, like seller financing, for instance, whatever the case is, that's where you put all that other ancillary forms, or the names of those forms to include. Okay, so the accepted offer documents described in line 50 to 54 are attached. Cancellation of accepted offer for buyer's property. Okay, like our example, the buyer 3 weeks before close of escrow says, oops, got a problem, my buyer canceled. Okay, if buyer's accepted offer cancels for any reason, buyer shall deliver notice to seller within 3 days, not 3 business days, within 3 days of buyer's receipt of cancellation, and again, provide evidence of the cancellation. Prove it, okay? So the buyer's just, not trying to get out of this because they found another house they like better. Notice the seller shall state buyer's election to either, same language, immediately cancel this contract and all earnest money shall be deemed released to buyer, or they're going to proceed with the contract by removing this contingency and provide, number 1, written documentation from buyer's lender that they can close on this house without the closing of the other one, or if it's a cash sale, evidence, proof of funds, essentially, that they can have the money to close on this one without using the money to close on the other one. So again, same language, they have 2 choices. So we put the burden, essentially, instead of the seller giving recourse to the seller if, in the first example, if the buyer's property doesn't go under contract by a certain date, and in the second scenario, if that contract does cancel, we don't say, okay, seller, here's your recourse. We kind of flipped it and said, okay, buyer, what are you going to do? You have 2 choices, either cancel or waive this contingency. But again, should buyer elect to proceed with this contract, seller and buyer agree that all other contingencies shall remain. So this does not affect the appraisal contingency, does not affect the financing contingency. It essentially reverts back to the original purchase contract and all the terms and conditions in that purchase contract. And then we have the buyer contingency. If closing does not occur by the date specified on line 36, and again, that's the closing date, this contract shall be deemed canceled and earnest money shall be released to the buyer. So in this particular case, they have waived if closing does not occur by the date specified on line 36, this contract shall be deemed canceled and earnest money shall be released to the buyer. So, so that's pretty much it. You got a place for seller and buyer initials. And then, like we just said, we went over, then the following terms apply to either contingency agreed to the above, because you got the two different sections above where it talks about buyer shall deliver a copy of the seller's, buyer shall deliver a copy of their contract on their house to the seller within 3 days. And you've got the purchase contract and any other ancillary forms that would be important. And then you have the underside agrees to the modified or additional terms and conditions contained herein, signatures, broker's little box for manager's initials, and that's pretty much it. So we're going to go ahead and unmute you here. Okay, hold on.
The leader has unmuted your line.
Okay, so we're going to open it up to any questions. So does anybody have any questions on that?
I have one point of reference, Martha. During your presentation, if you reference when you're jumping around from section 1 to section 2 and then to section 3 of
how are you? I mean, scare me.
Sorry. If you should reference the line number that you're referring to and saying,
you're all talking over the question. I can't hear. So if you can wait until he answers or he finishes his question, I'd appreciate it. So are you saying I jump around too much?
Yes. Refer to the line number of the contract.
Okay, I can certainly do that. I appreciate the positive criticism. Thank you very much. And you're right. I know, especially when you don't have the full form there, you know, you're right that I should be jumping back to the actual line. So thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Martha, the purchase contract that needs to be provided by the buyer, referenced in lines 53 and 54, assuming that the information, the buyer's information on that contract, the purchaser, I should say, that contract, that can be blackened out because you wouldn't want that seller having that information.
Right. No, you can certainly do that.
Okay. And then going back to those, if you could flip back to the other page, sorry, at section 46, the buyer's contingency, can there be a cure for that?
No, it's not a curable event.
Okay, that was my...
That's a good question. Thank you, because actually I got a question, because when these draft forms go out to what we call the loop, the realtor loop, throughout the state, and there's probably, goes out to maybe 75 to 100 people, and they're allowed to make remarks that the work group then goes through question by question by question. And this actually, I got a phone call from another big broker here in Phoenix that asked me if whether that was do you issue a cure if that doesn't happen? And the answer is no. It's an uncurable event because it's an unfulfilled contingency.
Okay.
To equate it to in the purchase contract, the financing contingency. Okay, if the buyer provides a loan denial letter to the seller, then they can't close. So that's not a curable event. That's an unfulfilled contingency.
Thank you.
Martha, when does the buyer who signs this contingency addendum on the home that they want to purchase with the seller start their inspection period?
Immediately.
When do they do their inspection and go through the BINSR?
Yeah, that would all be immediately. It doesn't change any of the time frames. So all the time frames in the purchase contract still apply. So it's not like the short sale addendum where everything is delayed. Now all the time frames in the contract are still apply. So then that not only is the inspection period, but you have the SPDS and you've got the LSU from the buyer if that's the case, because that's really important, obviously, the LSU in this particular case. And the insurance claims history, whatever it is, any of the time frames in the purchase contract start just like it would. And remember, this is just an addendum. So it's no different than the appraisal addendum or the unfulfilled loan contingency. I'm sorry, the appraisal contingency or the unfulfilled loan contingency in the purchase contract.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Martha,
Mm-hmm.
if the buyer does not notify the seller within the 3-day period that their contract has fallen out of escrow, what's the ramifications there?
Then if they don't do it, then they're going forward. So if buyer's accepted offer cancels for any reason, this is lines 15 to 16, buyer shall deliver notice to seller within 3 days of buyer's receipt of cancellation or provide evidence of cancellation. If they don't provide evidence, then they're going forward.
Okay. Well, let's say they provide evidence 5 days later instead of 3 days.
Then, per the terms of the terms of the addendum, they're outside of what they agreed to. So, so at that point, I would say that they, it's kind of like waiting until after the inspection period to receive a BINSR. That they're out of the time frame and so it's valid.
Martha?
Mm-hmm.
So if they don't give you notice of cancellation and you think they're going to proceed, then closing date comes and goes and they can't close because their buyer bailed, then would the earnest money be in jeopardy?
Yes. Yes. The earnest money would be because they are going forward, and so you can't go and it's already past all the dates and everything. So they've agreed that they had the opportunity to cancel and didn't, and since they didn't cancel, then they're proceeding with the contract. And if they can't close, then essentially they've already waived that part of that contingency. Any other questions?
Martha, can you hear me?
I can, Carolyn. How are you?
How did you know? Anyway,
I don't know. How do I know that I'm talking to Miss Carolyn Hayes? You can all tell where she's from.
I was thinking, after the seller is assured from the lender that the buyer can qualify, and move forward with the loan, I mean, there's no contingencies at that time, and then say 2 weeks later they get a denial letter, then the seller is just out of luck, right?
Well, it depends on what the denial letter is. They have assured the seller that the buyer can move forward without selling their home, and so the seller is fine with that, and they're moving forward, and then 2 or 3 weeks later, before closed escrow, they get a denial letter. Then there's nothing the seller can do, right? No, that's not true, because again, line 19 on the first page says that the buyer has elected to, in this case, let's say Carolyn has proceeded with the contract by removing the contingency.
Right.
They've removed the contingency. They must receive or must give the seller written documentation from the buyer's lender that they can do so, okay, that they can close without the necessity of the closing of the other property, and then something happens. Well, okay, if the loan denial is based on the fact that they needed to close on the other property, okay, then, sorry, you waived the contingency. You're stuck, okay?
But suppose it's something different.
If it's something different, then the unfulfilled loan contingency in the purchase contract would still prevail. That's why we say that in line 22, should buyer elect to proceed with this contract, seller and buyer agree that all other contingencies remain. It could, like the appraisal contingency, for instance.
Okay. Well, I was just still thinking that it could be something related to the buyer's, financing. I mean, something else maybe on the financing. Well,
and we do know, unfortunately, that sometimes lenders goof, or a matter of getting to underwriting, and up to that point, everything was going fine, and then the underwriters are the ones that make that decision.
Exactly.
The buyer has to understand up front that's the risk they are taking, and they could risk their earnest money or seller damages more than their earnest money if that happens. You know, it's no different than and I'm sure we've all heard this, can't close escrow because it's the buyer's lender's fault. Can't close the escrow on a particular day because the loan officer went on vacation or whatever the case is. So it's not my fault, the buyer says. It's my lender's fault. And even with the 3-day cure, because obviously that's a curable event for the close of escrow, the buyer says, well, it's not my fault because it's my lender's. Well, sorry, buyer, you picked the lender, and the lender's not a party to the contract, so you didn't close, no matter whose fault it is, so you're responsible. So it's kind of the same situation here, Carolyn.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else?
Yeah, Martha, G2.
Hey, G2.
Hey. So to go to Carolyn's scenario, and we all know that Dodd-Frank has given the lenders a whole pile full of new requirements to scrutinize loan documents. And a couple of transactions come to mind in my head that we just went through on our inventory, and that was that let's assume that this buyer, our fictitious buyer here, bought off on, I don't need to sell the house, fine, let's move forward. But comes along this additional review process that now the lenders will undertake on documents, and we had a situation where the buyer's, the shelf life of the buyer's bank statements had expired, and the underwriter asked for updated bank statements.
Right.
So I'm going to paint a picture here because we got it resolved. But let's assume that happens. Underwriter says, okay, your bank statements have expired. I need new ones. And this is a true story. The bank statements were requested just after Christmas. During the Christmas season, the buyer had received several checks, substantial checks, for Christmas gifts from people, family friends. And he deposited them into his account. These weren't there with the original bank statements, but they were there after Christmas. The underwriter wanted a written confirmation. It was an FHA deal, written confirmation that these monies that had been deposited were gifts and were not going to be repaid. Mm-hmm. Let's assume that the buyer, and in this case, one of those checks came from a relative in France. So let's assume for a minute that the relative in France, for some reason, or any of them, will not provide the buyer with the piece of paper that the underwriter wanted now to clear that file. The way I'm hearing you is then if the underwriter is going to deny this loan because he or she cannot satisfy herself with this documentation, then that becomes a valid out for the buyer, and he did nothing wrong, and his earnest money would be returned. Am I tracking this right?
Well, it depends, G2. Okay, so the buyer they've already received something that says you don't have to close on this other house. You can, right. We'll loan you you can take out a loan in order to close on this house. You don't have to close on the other one. Everything's going fine. Then all of a sudden the underwriter says, okay, we need this, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, they've already removed by going forward, and again, it's lines 19 through 21, they've removed this contingency. Okay, so now it goes back.
They removed the contingency of selling the house.
Right. Okay. But they
didn't remove the contingency of loan approval.
For them.
Correct. So again, then it would go back to the financing contingency in the purchase contract.
And that's what I'm saying. So in this scenario, if the underwriter cannot be satisfied for our buyer's documents, because and this really did happen, we were able to get all the letters, so we closed. But if for some reason a letter of that the underwriter requested could not be produced, and then the underwriter issues a denial letter for, and they'd probably articulate the reason, that denial would fall under the loan contingency, and therefore the buyer's earnest money is safe.
Right, because it's a different reason other than the fact that they couldn't sell their home.
Right, fair enough.
Sell the other house.
Martha, on lines 51 through 52, if you have added a pre-qual from that buyer, are you able to have leeway to call that lender and verify, or are you just satisfied with getting the pre-qual?
Well, okay, depending on where well, remember, the pre-qual, number one, is not required, but the LSU is, okay?
Okay.
So there should be an LSU there. I would certainly request, I mean, the seller can't arbitrarily call the buyer's lender, but you could certainly request it and get the buyer's permission to do it. But just like in any deal, because what you would be doing is calling on their buyer's lender, not this buyer's lender, right? You get the LSU.
Or right, it would be their buyer's lender.
Right. So now it's an arm's length buyer, if you will. It's not even this buyer, it's another buyer. So I would, it'd be up to that buyer's whether or not they wanted to give the seller permission to call. But I absolutely would not, because our seller is not a party to that contract.
Exactly. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Okay, well, I thank you all for joining me this afternoon. Yeah, one other question? No? Okay. Yeah, again, if you have any questions, feel free to give me a call here in a few minutes or shoot me an email or whatever. I very much appreciate you all joining me this afternoon, and I appreciate the questions and the helpful hints. And we'll hopefully you'll hear from me again in a month, and I'll have, who knows what forms or new forms may come up or issues that may come up. If any of you ever want to request I talk about a specific form, please don't hesitate to send me an email. I get many of those, and I do end up discussing those forms, so please do that. And you all have a great weekend and a great month, and we'll talk to you towards the end of February. So thanks again for coming. All right. Bye-bye.